Indeed, it is very symbolic that we meet this morning in the Vilnius train station, the place which is historic by all means, and a meeting point of peoples, a meeting point of ideas, a meeting point of cultures and different countries. It is the connecting point between East and West and North and South. And how symbolic that especially here today we host the first Pan-Baltic Infrastructure Summit in Vilnius, which of course feels itself being in the heart of Europe, but also holds Europe in its heart. And in the Baltic states that find themselves in the core of European project. All three members of the Eurozone, all three members of the Schengen zone, all three proud members of the European and transatlantic community. And coincidentally also some of the most pro-European, Euro-enthusiastic states in this region. 13 years after membership, we feel fully integrated, yet to achieve that full integration and independence, of course, the infrastructure is key. Infrastructure in terms of transport, in terms of energy, in terms of energy efficiency. For the Baltic region to be fully back in the European family, to feel connected not only mentally but also physically with the rest of Europe. So indeed, this is a very important time to speak about it, as the European Union is going through tremendous transformation, massive rethinking and recharging of the project. And as President Juncker said in the couple of weeks old speech, the wind is back in Europe's sails. Today we're experiencing a very solid economic performance in most of the Eurozone countries. Today we're also experiencing a solid political health in European Union, with elections after elections providing a pro-European, rational, open-minded parties taking over the leadership in most of the member states. So this is the momentum, a good momentum to instill more life in the European project, to think about its future, to think about the future and not the past, and indeed to think how to still make sure that our economy grows further. And in that sense, structural reforms and investments are very important. European Union also, of course, is fully engaged in terms of facilitating and fostering further investments, in terms of structural funds, which account for 480 billion in just this financial perspective, in terms of TNT projects, Trans-European Network, which includes Rail Baltica, which is so critical for this region, and of course the famous EFSI, European Fund for Strategic Investments, the Juncker Plan, that has the ambition to gather up to 500 billion euros of investments. And already in this region we have good examples in terms of Vilnius and Tallinn airports, or indeed the Bold Cap Infrastructure Fund, the co-organizer of this event that has just recently signed the agreement with the Juncker Plan. So let's think how to better invest in our countries, in our economies, in our infrastructure, and during those 2 days discuss the future economy, the 21st century economy, in terms of innovation in infrastructure, in terms of the role of the renewables, in terms of the market energy efficiency, and of course in terms of smart cities. We're living in a smart city of Vilnius, and in terms of much better public and private partnership. But to start our conference, it is my great pleasure to invite the keynote speaker of today and a very honored guest that we're hosting here in the city, the former Prime Minister of Finland and the former Minister of Finance and Foreign Affairs and Europe and Transport, you name it, and the currently Vice President of European Investment Bank, Alexander Stubb. Please.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. The first thing I will not mention today is Lithuanian basketball and the European Championships. I think you should have won, and you were a little bit unlucky in the quarterfinals. The second thing I have to mention when I'm at a railway station, actually my first touch, you know that the Baltic states and Finland and Russia, we have pretty much the same rail system, right? My first touch to this system was actually in 1982. I was elected to the Helsinki team in ice hockey at the tender age of 14. And we traveled to Moscow to play the Moscow team. And of course, you know, the Russian guys, they were much bigger and hairier and stronger and the rest of it. So, you know, we lost every match. But my dad at the time was the head of the Finnish Ice Hockey Federation. And I remember going on the train and my dad saying, you know, whatever you do, son, do not smuggle vodka back from Moscow to Finland. Because remember, 1982, you know, Stolichnaya, you could, you know, quite easily trade the vodka in. Well, I thought that, okay, well, we'll see. I'm 14, of course, I don't drink vodka. But you know, let's see if this works. So every guy on the team basically smuggled vodka, but they had it, you know, in the bags and things, and then the border guard came and, you know, basically took them all out. But I was the only one who succeeded in smuggling the vodka. Now, what I did was you know the shin pants that you have here by the knees? They have a little gap. So I took 2 bottles, and I put 1 in each, and then when the guard came in and said, we want to check your bag, do you have any vodka? I said, yes, I actually have 1 bottle. So I opened the bag, took the 1 bottle out and gave it to him, and he said, okay, that's fine, thanks for giving it. And then the rest of them, they didn't check. So I came to the train station, my dad was there, well, how was the tournament and things? It was great, but Dad, look, I got 2 bottles of vodka for you. He just looked at his, oh no, you know. So I have also told this story actually when I was foreign minister to Russian foreign minister Lavrov, and he thought it was a lot of fun. So that was my first touch to the railway system. Now, today, in the maximum of 15-20 minutes that I've been allotted, if you'd allow me, I would make the following points. Number 1, I'll say a few words about the European Investment Bank, the EIB. Second, I'll say a few words about the EIB here in the Baltics. Third, I'll say a few words about the European Fund for Strategic Investment, EFSI, and the work that it does here in the Baltics. And then finally, I'll say a few words on infrastructure. And then I'll draw a conclusion with 3 points. Now, first point today is the EIB. I mean, how many of you feel that you know what the EIB does? So there are a few people who work in the EIB who are sitting here around. Now, I'm an institutional nerd, right? I've worked almost in every EU institution. But before I came to the EIB, I did not understand really what it was all about. I think it's almost like the best kept secret in Europe. Now, just to give you a few indicators, the bank itself, the European Investment Bank, or the EU's bank, was founded in 1958, so at the same time with the European Economic Community. It is the biggest multilateral bank in the world. With all due respect, it's 10 times bigger than the EBRD, 10 times. It's 3 times bigger than the World Bank. It has assets of 600 billion euros. 600 billion euros. Juxtapose that with the Lithuanian state budget, which is probably around 30, 40 maximum. It has capital of almost 250 billion euros. It finances 80 billion euros worth of projects in Europe and outside per year. That's for the last 3 years. It's owned by all of the EU's 28 member states. The biggest states like the UK and France and Germany own about 16% each, and we, the smaller ones, own between 1 and 2%. The bank's finances, leverages, depending on how you calculate, at least 4-fold. And what we do is we get money from the financial markets, then we lend out that money at a competitive price, usually long term, and leverage the projects. We blend in with the private sector, so we never give a loan more than 50%, and we blend it with the private sector, and that makes the leverage. We have about 3,000 of staff, which we have in 40 offices around Europe and the world. 10% of our lending and financing goes outside the EU, 90% is inside the EU. And we have 4 areas that we work with, and the 4 areas are SMEs, infrastructure, which we'll talk about today, innovation, and then climate and environment. Now, what struck me when I started working for the bank is that it's not only the EU bank, but it's the bank of good news. You know, I'm used to taking crap for EU stuff, right? Why do you regulate that much? Why do you force austerity in my country? But this is the bank that basically says, listen, we like your project. It's really good. Let's see if we can finance it and help you to put that project into life. Now, the sad thing with the EIB is that I don't think the bank's been able to communicate this over the years. You know, I say this in jest, but nevertheless, we in the bank, we provide finance on a market basis. We don't regulate. We don't give out money. We don't give a subsidy. Whereas in the Commission, which I love, what happens is that it uses the 1% of the GDP, which is the size of the EU budget, to give grants to agriculture, to cohesion, to structural funds, to research, to foreign relations, to internal security, etc., etc. So that's the budget stuff. They give the money, whereas we lend the money, which is then leveraged. So that's my sort of elevator pitch on the EIB. Biggest multilateral bank in the world, lends out finances of 80 billion euros a year. It's a AAA institution and very functional. The second point I have is the EIB in the Baltics. Again, you don't see many EIB flags around projects. When you travel around, you usually see the EU has funded this highway, kind of a thing. Well, I was running down the riverbank, and as far as I understand, the EIB has financed part of that riverbank. It was still not finished at the end there when you take a left, but it's getting there. But there's no sign the EIB has financed this running path. But nevertheless, we are an important and substantial bank here as well. If you take the Baltics by and large, in 2016, so last year, we provided financing for 685 million euros. And about 40% of that actually was here in Lithuania. Now, that obviously depends a little bit on the year, right? Some years big projects are signed and sealed. At other years, it might be a little bit more quiet. If you look at the years from 2013 to 2016, 800 million euros worth of projects just here in Lithuania. And mostly it's been linked to energy or energy efficiency and transport. And the example that is good to give, I guess, here in Vilnius, and especially when I have lunch with your mayor, is that last year we put in 25 million euros to modernize school buildings, educational buildings, kindergartens, musical schools, etc., etc. Other big projects, obviously, 190 million to Lietuvos Energia on the CHP units. So we do a lot of the big stuff, but that's not only it. We also provide guarantees for regional smaller banks, which then give lending to SMEs. So it's a lot about leveraging. We don't give anyone money directly, but we leverage, we get people to use the money in the right way for big projects. And we can do that because we're a public bank. We're not a private bank, and we're actually very cost competitive because of our AAA rating, because of the fact that people trust us when the member states own us, and it works. So that's the EIB in a nutshell. My third point today is on EFSI. So that's the famous, Juncker plan. Now the Juncker plan has actually 3 pillars, and one of them is the European Fund for Strategic Investment, or EFSI. And that is basically, I would argue, what has changed the DNA or almost the existence of the EIB. Because at the end of the day, it's the EIB who manages, finances, and advises on the Juncker plan. Now, what is it all about? You've heard about it a little bit, and you've probably thought that, this is, just one of these, bureaucratic things. No, it's not. It's something that Jean-Claude Juncker and his commission came up with a few years ago. And the idea was to put in guarantees or partial guarantees of 16 billion euros. I think 11 from the Commission and 5 from the EIB, or was it 16 from the Commission and 5 from the EIB? Nevertheless, which would then end up funding projects up to 315 billion euros. So you put in 16 to 21, and then you get private investors coming in, and it leverages up to 315 billion euros. How have we done so far? Well, actually really well. So well that we're already talking about EFSI 2.0. We've already gone now, as of to date, up to 236 billion of the leveraged money. So remember, target 315, we've already gone to 236 billion. So today in 2017, remember it ends at the end of 2018, we've already done 75% of what we're supposed to do. And because the system is working so well, we will do an EFSI 2.0, which is basically leveraging up to 500 billion in 2020. I know there are a lot of figures, but if you think about it, 2018, 350 billion, 2020, 500 billion. Now, is this free money or cheap money, and what's the value added? Well, it's not free money, obviously, but it is cheap money. And you might want to ask me, well, why is the EU, the Commission and the EIB doing this? Well, the reason is very simple. And that is that if you look at the financing of the EU, right? The financing of the EU is such that you have, on one hand, grants, or the EU budget, which is 150 billion a year, 1,000 billion euros for 7 years. And that's not going to increase. Be realistic. All of those of you who think that MFF 2020, the multi-annual financial framework, is going to increase to over 1% of the GDP, it ain't going to happen. So that's why you need to start looking at alternative financing. And the alternative financing are the so-called financial instruments and budget guarantees. That's what the EIB does. So when you are not going to get more subsidies, you are going to end up using more financial instruments. And that's pretty much what EFSI is all about. What has EFSI done here in the Baltics? The CHP plants here in Lithuania that I mentioned, the Tallinn airport, University of Latvia campus, public transport in Riga. I just signed there a couple of weeks ago on hydrogen buses. And then in Estonia, for instance, a company called Skeleton, which does supercapacities. So you can see that these are sort of semi-big projects, not enormous, but things that EFSI has done. Now, my final and becomes, I guess, fourth point is on infrastructure then in general before I conclude. It's nice to be here partially as a guest of Baltcap, the infrastructure fund which we have financed with approximately 20 million euros from the EIB. The idea being is that we have a infrastructure fund, and because we get involved, we crowd in other investors on transport and for instance energy. Because as a former foreign minister, I'm quite worried about the level of energy dependency that we see in the Baltic region from, for instance, Russia. And it's something that we're trying to alleviate and perhaps facilitate with the work that we do also in the EIB. Now, the basic point that I have here is that I think that the Baltic states are, on infrastructure funding, are too dependent on the public sector. And as I said earlier, that's not the way of the future. Basic infrastructure, be it transport, energy or others, is going to need more private money. That's just the direction in which the world goes. It's not going to be seen as a basic public good in the traditional sense that it's always been. And that's why we need to get involved. Now, what happened on the European level? Well, you had two pieces of legislation which had an influence on this. One piece of legislation was Basel III, which essentially made infrastructure investments a little bit more complicated and a little bit more expensive for banks. But the mirror of that is Solvency II, which allows for other investors, for instance, insurance companies and pension funds, to get more involved in bigger infrastructure investments. So these two have sort of affected things. But my message is that, if you look at the infra projects here in the Baltics, we need more of a mix of the public sector and the private sector. And it's not so much a shortage of finance, but it's about bankable projects and regulatory risk. And something needs to be done by that. So, my, again, elevator speech on this, that please use the EIB on this. Because we crowd in private investors, because we have the European Investment Advisory Hub, so we can actually give advice on this. And on top of that, we have the expertise on public and private investment. And there are a lot of examples which I won't get into on this. So my conclusion today, ladies and gentlemen, so that I stick to the allotted time, is threefold. Whatever you remember from this, just remember three things. Number one is that the European Investment Bank is your bank. It's the EU's bank. Use it. It lends out cheap money, which at the end of the day works. It's a safe place to go to. Number two, the future of finance in the European Union is going to be different. And by that I mean that we're going to move away from direct grants and subsidies to agriculture or cohesion or structural funds. So the redistributive value of the EU is going to decline, and it's going to move towards financial instruments and guarantees. So you have to put that hat on. Don't think that let's go to Brussels and get some money for this. No, go to Luxembourg and see what kind of a loan you might be getting in order to leverage whichever project you have. So don't think in the next MFF with your cohesion hat. Think with your banker's hat. And number three, when it comes to big infrastructure projects, think in terms of PPPs, so private and public partnerships. That's the future of it. And I'm sure that when we get into the Q&A discussion, we'll talk about the fourth industrial revolution and what it actually means to, in a broader sense. And then I can be a little bit more specific. So here, ladies and gentlemen, we're in all shortness. Number one, what the EIB is all about and what it does here in the Baltic region. Number two, what EFSI is all about and what it does here in the Baltic region. And number three, what is the future of infrastructure projects and how you should look at them. So these were my 2 cents of advice, and I do thank you for giving me the opportunity to come to this wonderful venue and railway station, even without the vodka. Thank you.
So thank you so much for this very sharp and clear and very interesting presentation for all of us. Perhaps, to start the discussion, I would like to jump on what you have just finished. That we should understand that the EU finances will change. That we will move away from redistribution and direct subsidies and structural and cohesion funds towards alternative financing ways and financial instruments. For this country and for this region, this is very important, of course, question, because Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia as well have been heavily dependent on structural funds, cohesion funds. In this country, up to 70% of public investment is coming from the EU. And of course, looking at Brexit and the new budget, which might be much smaller and of course more timid, and looking at the economic development of Lithuania and other Baltic states, where the countries are moving away from being the recipients to being the donors. What is your advice, to the business community and also to the public institutions, how to best prepare for it?
I guess the first observation is that you're absolutely right that cohesion and structural funds have been a big part of the development of, for instance, Lithuania, also Latvia and Estonia. The first piece of advice is to change the mindset, because that money is not going to be there forever. I mean, the whole idea with European cohesion policy is obviously to try to make it into a level playing field. Now, my recollection is that Lithuania has a GDP per capita which now exceeds 20,000 euros. You have an unemployment rate which is below 9%. You have a fairly robust economic development and modernization. So it's an example of why the cohesion funds have basically worked. But I think the future of the world is not so much in alimony and grants. It's more in innovation. And that's why you need to focus on that. I mean, Vilnius, for instance, is obviously one of the key financial centers in the region, and especially in the Baltics. That's something you need to look at. You need to start looking at fintech and whatever future finance is going to mean. You need to focus a lot on the fourth industrial revolution, on digitalization, robotization, 3D printing, Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, these types of things. So, the future doesn't lie in agricultural subsidies or structural grants. I'm not saying that you shouldn't use them. Of course you should, but you need to think beyond them. Now, MFF 2020, which is jargon for the EU financial framework, which will be settled in 2020, is obviously going to be a battle, as it always is. It's between net contributors, net receivers. It's between those who are for grants, against grants. It's between those who want to have more in agriculture, those who want to have less. It's a classic power game. There's no question about it, and obviously Lithuania will have to play its role, but start thinking beyond that. That's my advice.
Well, this, of course, as you say, classical inertia probably will dominate again the talks, as budget negotiations are always, probably the battlefield where the principles and the tactics rarely change. The fourth industrial revolution you've mentioned, and looking towards the future of innovation and robotics and artificial intelligence that you've mentioned, how much you think this will be a part of the decision makers' minds when they will think strategically about EU investments into the future?
Well, I hope it is, but my big problem is I've been reading a lot on the fourth industrial revolution, and I'll get back to that in a second, but my big fear is that political decision makers do not fundamentally understand the potential and the implications of the fourth industrial revolution. Now, my answer might be a little bit long, but hopefully worth listening to. So when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, we talk about such mega trends as digitalization, robotization, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, and 3D printing and beyond. Now, why is it called the fourth industrial revolution? Because it has been preceded by three revolutions: agriculture, industry, digitalization, and now this one. And if you look at the second industrial revolution and the emergence of first the steam engine and then electricity, it took a while for the system to start to work. Now, if I can give you one book to read, I think the two guys that probably analyze these megatrends the best are Erik Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee. They are at the MIT. And they've basically written two books together. One is called The Second Machine Age. And the newest one that they have now written, and I've actually only just started reading, is called Machine, Platform, and Crowd. So machine, platform, and crowd. And the basic argument, just to put it into context of the world that we live in, is that they are finding a balance between the human mind and the machine, between the product and the platform, and between the core and the crowd. What does this mean? It means that we're moving away from the traditional way in which we use our brains to solve problems, because there are a lot of machines that can do it for us. For instance, the smartphone, of which there are a few billion around the world. We have all the information at hand, and things that we had to do before manually, filing, bills, everything, we can now do on that. You know, my children who are 13 and 15, they will not remember the world before the smartphone. They will be diagnosed, and I will be diagnosed better by artificial intelligence and most probably a microchip under my skin than by you as a doctor. Their children will never go to school in a vehicle which has a driver. The most audacious claim that I saw was that human beings will not be allowed to drive a car in 2050 because we're a liability, a risk. So that's the machine bit. And you know, a machine can already beat Jeopardy, it can beat, you know, Go, the best player in Go, the best player in chess, etc., etc. The product and platform thing is that if you think about distribution of products before, you had to have broad networks like Walmart, you know, 600 distribution centers and goods flowing around. But what are the most valuable companies today? You know, Facebook doesn't provide content. Airbnb doesn't own real estate. Uber doesn't own cars. So the whole business model is changing. And my point here is not that, you know, railway infrastructure is suddenly going to become free for all and not owned by the state or a private entity. But the bottom line is that if we don't start thinking in these terms, we're going to lose out. And the final point is core versus crowd. Nowadays, it's crowds that are able to establish pretty much the smartest entities. So it's not anymore that we keep the information and then have a little brainstorming session and provide for an idea. It comes in other ways. So my advice is in this is you need to understand the balance between the mind and the machine, how far we take it. You need to understand the balance between the product or service and the platform that provides that service. And then you need to understand that we're moving from a world where decisions are made in the core to a world where crowds are the ones that do it. So that would be my 2 cents worth on the fourth industrial revolution.
Of course, for this country where we have a very large immigration, you know, robotics might be a game changer in terms of shrinking population. However, of course, that does not solve the more existential issue of the survival of the state. You've talked about Finland as your native country many times, it being so successful because of its being so open, stable, and international. And of course, having one of the highest happiness index in the world. We try to be here also very open, we try to be stable, We really endeavor to be international, but still our people are quite depressed. And as I mentioned, are leaving in big numbers and emigrating abroad. Maybe to this crowd and to this audience, what is your advice of this Finnish secret of happiness?
Yeah, you know, all of us Finns look really happy all the time. You know what the difference between an introvert and extrovert Finn is, right? The introvert, when he talks to you, he looks at his own feet, and the extrovert, when he talks to you, he looks at your feet, you know. I don't know where these happiness indexes come from. No, I mean, I think essentially history has proven fairly well that in order for a society to be successful, you need three elements. One is a liberal democracy, which in essence is freedom of choice. Two is a social market economy, which basically means free entrepreneurship combined with some kind of a welfare model which takes care of basic security from education to health to aging. And then three, globalization. So basically open borders and free movement. And if you combine these three, and especially if you come from a small country like Finland, then you end up being quite successful. And my argument has been that during the Cold War, Finland was, you know, there are about 200 countries in the world, right? Finland was about, you know, top 30 or so. Because of the Soviet Union, we're not able to be as free as we wanted. I mean, I don't need to tell this story here in Lithuania. But once the shackles of the Cold War were unleashed, Finland did two things which changed us from top 30 to what I would argue top 3 in the world. One was to truly open up. We went for free enterprise, we went for free trade, we went for innovation, research, you know, Nokia emerged and the rest of it. And then two was to join the European Union. So we became part of an institutional establishment which gave us security. I mean, you're lucky, you're in both NATO and the EU, but you know, we're just in the EU. Now, does this all mean happiness? No, it doesn't, of course not. But it gives a good basis. For me, then happiness at the end of the day, you know, comes from the individual and an individual balance. And then you can try to promote that with some societal means. But I think happiness is usually quite often embedded in security, that you have a feeling that, you know, you're secure. Secondly, in opportunity, that you have a possibility to fulfill yourself no matter what it is. And thirdly, I actually think at the end of the day, a lot of it is about empathy. And the further we go into the robotization of this world, when, you know, we can ask Alexa what we're supposed to wear, or we can tell our vacuum cleaner to do the job for us, the more time is left for human interaction. And in that human interaction, I think empathy is going to be the key, that the way in which you behave towards others, the way in which you interact. And I think that's what brings happiness at the end of the day. But there's no magic potion. I mean, who would think that Finland is ranked as the happiest country in the world? Certainly it can't have anything to do with the weather.
Definitely not the weather. Of course, the learning is such a beautiful thing about the Baltic region, because we've learned so much from Finland and from Sweden and from Denmark and other partners throughout our transition and transformation. You authored in 2006 with Thomas Ilves, the former president of Estonia, the Baltic Sea strategy in European Parliament, when both of you were members of European Parliament. The strategy, which back then, 11 years, had an ambition to protect the Baltics, the Baltic Sea, to connect the region, and to increase prosperity. Now, 10 years since, do you think we have used the full potential of Baltic cooperation?
Well, never. You know, you never use the full potential. It's always going to be, you know, a halfway house. But it was something that Thomas and I and many others thought about at the time, that we were moving towards entities of regional integration. And we looked at the Nordic countries, we looked at the Baltics, we looked at Poland, and we looked at Germany, and came to the conclusion, well, as a matter of fact, this is one of the most successful regions in the world. Why don't we try to brand it and work together? We, of course, also had a concern for the Baltic Sea, which was in a dire state at the time. and thought that this could be, give a value added. And as a matter of fact, if I recall correctly, it's one of the only times when the European Parliament has done an own initiative report, which then has become an initiative of the European Commission. So has it fulfilled its full potential? No, but has it raised awareness? Of course it has, and I think it's been fairly successful. Of course it could be a little bit better as well. But for you to say that, the Baltic states have looked up to Finland and Sweden and so on, to be quite honest, I would look at it from the other perspective as well. I mean, the place of Finland in history is obviously quite humble in comparison to the place of Lithuania and the role that Lithuania has played in this region in historic terms. So we should not be short-sighted in this, and all you need to do is to go to Old Town and realize that, the Old Town here is truly old in comparison to the so-called Old Town in Helsinki, which became the capital of Finland in 1812.
And to finish our conversation, I really would like to use this opportunity, as we have you with us, with so much experience in terms of Europe. Today we have many speeches collapsing on us, from Juncker's speech to Theresa May's speech to Emmanuel Macron's speech just 2 days ago, about the future of Europe, with very bold and visionary ideas that bring us forward. What is your vision for the future of Europe?
A small question to end with. I guess my first observation is to say what a difference a year makes. Had we been standing here, say, in November 2016, 2 months from now, and having looked back at Brexit, having looked back at the election of Donald Trump, and the rise of both left and right populism and anti-Europeanism, we could have been potentially quite depressed. And I think Juncker illustrated that in his speech. If you compare his State of the Union address from September 2016 to September 2017, it's like day and night. So things change, and in that sense you could say that the EU is cyclical. We go from one crisis to another. It's a crisis management institution. It was just that we got a double hit, financial crisis 2007, 2011, then Euro crisis 2011, 2015, then asylum crisis 2015, 2017, and the emergence of populism, and we had to react to that. Now, my second observation is that in a perverse kind of a way, Brexit has brought the EU closer together. I've never seen such a unified European Union. There's much less bickering. I'm not saying that, say, the governments of Poland and Hungary are exactly the epitome of liberal Europeanism and pro-Europeanism, but my argument is that if you look at it as a whole, we're seeing now language coming from Juncker, coming from Macron, coming from Merkel, which is completely different in tone that we have seen in a long, long time. My final observation is, and this is having been an academic and a civil servant and a politician and now a banker of European affairs, is that, the EU always manages to muddle through. It will always be more than an international organization, but it will most probably always be less than a state. And the natural process of European integration usually has 3 phases. Phase number 1 is a crisis. Phase number 2 is chaos. And phase number 3 is a suboptimal solution. And that's just how it goes. And we live with it. I always want more Europe. There's no question about it. And I think that there is a certain determinism about the process as well. So we'll survive this one, we'll go forward, and it was nice to see Macron's speech. It's probably one of those 50-50. 50% of the stuff is somewhere up in the sky and in the moon, and 50% is realistic. So we'll see another push for more integration come 2020.
As we're getting our stuff together in Europe, how would you respond to the question of your colleague, Carl Bildt, who asked 2 weeks ago in Kiev, David Cameron and John Kerry, a very simple question: how to bring back the United States back to the world, and how to bring UK back to Europe? Would you have an answer?
I'm just a humble banker nowadays. I should not make any political statements in any which way. First of all, I think Carl is right to ask the question, and I say this as a strong Anglophile. I'm married to a Brit. My children have dual nationality. I'm also a strong transatlanticist. I've studied in the States, and I'm a child of the Anglo-Saxon liberal world, if you will. How do we bring them back? Well, to be quite honest, right now things look quite dire, because the United States cannot be the leader of the world if it rejects the world in the way in which the Trump administration is rejecting it. You cannot be the star of globalization if you protect your borders. You cannot be the star of immigration if you start building walls. You cannot be the number one in the world if you put America first. And obviously, you know, the action that we have seen from the current president of the United States excludes the US from not frontline, but from leading the world for the next 3 to 7 years, depending on how long the administration stands. With Great Britain and Brexit, same thing. You know, I think the UK did a good transition from empire to world power by having a nuclear weapon, being members of NATO, members of the EU, and members of the UN Security Council. But now they are voluntarily marginalizing themselves, and they are basically waking up and smelling the coffee. I think Brexit is a tragedy. It's a complete lose-lose situation. And to bring the Anglo-Saxon world, the United Kingdom and the United States back to the world stage will take time. They have done a voluntary marginalization, and to come back from that voluntary marginalization, I don't know how it's going to happen, but I think Carl Bildt was right to ask the question.
Thank you so much for your words of wisdom, and indeed we will tell the mayor to put the sign that the runway that you used this morning was financed by the EIB. And thank you so much also for that message.
I was just wondering, can it be called the Alex runway? Is
good idea.
Okay? Yeah.
Because also we had one of our Grand Dukes named Alexander, so that will...
We can put his statue up.
And of course, we took a note of what you said, that EIB is also our bank. Imagine the biggest multinational bank is also our bank, and we should fully use it and its resources. Thank you so much for being with us today, for sharing your thoughts, and we always welcome you back to Vilnius at any moment. Thank you.
Thanks.